Now, at this point, there have been quite a few bad financial decisions being made, not only on a personal level in the United States and in Western Europe, but also on a business level and in some cases on a national level. Um, but there is not a quote unquote economic crisis just yet. What you have in the United States and in many parts of the Western world is a lot of people are essentially living on credit. They are living on borrowed money and borrowed time in order to continue to make payments, in order to continue to upkeep the lifestyle that they became accustomed to over the first half of the 1920s. However, um, round about 1926, all of this starts coming to a halt. Things start grinding down financially. And this leads to what's known as a credit crunch. So, banks, up until about the 1970s, made the majority of their profit on loaning out money. Okay. Nowadays, many banks make the majority of their profit from offering investment services or investment packages, things like bonds and T bills and all these different kinds of investment tools. But in the 1920s, the majority of banks made their money by loaning out money and collecting interest on those loans. But around about 1926, large numbers of personal and business investors, especially in the United States, begin to start defaulting on the borrowed money, the credit that they've acquired. Meaning that not only are banks now losing out on the funds that they loaned out, that money is now gone, but they also lose out on the interest payments, which are essentially their only way to be profitable. And they lose out on the monthly or weekly payments that were being made by their creditors. So essentially, they are now not only losing that money, but they also don't have day to day liquid cash flow in order to cover their own operations, pay their employees, keep their lights on, keep the doors open, etc. So around about 1925, 1926, banks, especially in the United States, start cracking down on who they're going to lend money to and how much they're going to lend to them. And this is what's known as a credit crunch. Okay. Banks begin tightening restrictions on loans, they begin tightening restrictions on how much money people can borrow. And because of this, more and more people begin to default on the money that they already owe because they are unable to borrow more money to continue making monthly payments on their already overextended credit, right? This is where the financial crisis begins because as banks crunch down on who's allowed to borrow money, this creates more defaulting investors. As more people begin to default on their loans, more and more banks have to crunch down on credit, and it becomes essentially a cyclical problem. Eventually, it gets to the point in 1927, that banks around the United States and some in Western Europe begin to fail, meaning that the bank is no longer profitable. It can no longer pay its employees. It can no longer pay um, its own debts to other banks and to the U.S. Treasury, and the banks begin to fold and the banks begin to close. And what this means is not only is it now harder to borrow money, but even people who were not overextended on their credit now face financial ruin because when that bank closes, their money disappears with the bank uses the money it has to pay off debts, and people's entire life savings are wiped out instantly. So this leads to widespread banking failure across the United States. Generations of saved money and generations of um, good financial decisions are wiped out within the matter of 2 or 3 years. And that creates a banking crisis, especially in the United States. So people begin to panic and they begin to run to their banks and pull out all of their money because they're worried that their bank may be the next one to fail. Well, what this does is this actually causes more banks to fail because now the banks that were still financially solvent have no more money to lend. And as they have no more money to lend, they cannot profit off of that interest. And so basically, what you see is, again, widespread bank failure all across the United States, which then trickles down to banks in Western Europe who dependent upon large scale loans from American banks to keep their own doors open, right? So this leads to domino number six, right? The lack of cheap funds, especially from the United States, leads to a global market failure. Businesses can no longer borrow money, they can no longer afford payroll, shipping, etc. So businesses begin to close left and right. This leads to widespread unemployment. That widespread unemployment leads to further default on credit, which causes more bank failure, which starts the cycle all over again. And on the global scale, because Western Europe and the United States are are the dominant manufacturing centers of the world, as businesses in the West begin to close at a large rate and banks in the West begin to fail at a large rate, the suppliers of raw materials to those businesses and to those manufacturing markets start to see a massive drop in demand for their products as well. That allows this financial crisis to now trickle down into the colonies of Africa, into the colonies in Asia, and into Latin America, which was, for the majority of World War One, the main supplier of foodstuffs to the Western world as they fought the wars, right? Now, the seminal event, the event that for most people defines the start of the Great Depression, is the US stock market crash in 1929. And this is in reality just the culmination of all of the events that lead up to this point. Business failures, the overextension of credit, massive unemployment, which then leads to massive homelessness, the foreclosure of millions of houses in the United States, failing businesses left and right, the inability of both businesses and governments to borrow large sums of money to just cover their daily and even weekly expenses, basically reduces consumer confidence in not only the US market, but in the global capital market to almost nothing. People begin pulling their money out of the stock market en masse. And finally, in 1929, it reaches a head and the US stock market completely crashes. US businesses lose somewhere between 60 to 70% of their value across 3 days in 1929. And that drives even large scale corporations who had been financially solvent and had been able to keep employing people basically to the brink of bankruptcy, which then forces them to begin cutting production even further, cutting jobs and labor even further, and just generally worsens the crisis completely, right? So once this depression hits, what does it look like around the world? So worldwide, national personal income drops by over 50%, which is incredibly devastating. Meaning that the average household anywhere in the world sees their income and their cash intake drop by over half. That means that many people cannot afford to pay mortgages on homes. That means that people cannot afford to live in areas that their family has lived in for generations. So millions upon millions of families lose their homes, especially in the United States, but also in Western Europe. You have armies, literal armies of homelessness and homeless people who flood into urban areas looking for work. Um, when you get to APUSH next year, this is a huge, huge topic, and they'll talk, and you'll learn more about the Hoover armies and the Hoover towns that get set up around the United States. Um, Now, this very rapid urbanization also completely overwhelms the social and the infrastructure in major cities. There's simply not enough housing. There are not enough homeless shelters. There is not enough public charity outlets to take on this massive influx of people. So you have millions, tens of millions of people that end up living in the streets or living in their cars. Worldwide, millions of people starve. Crops that they could be eating are just simply rotting in the fields because farmers are unable to pay labor or to pay for equipment to harvest them. Socially, there are huge spikes in divorce. There's a huge increase in mental illness, alcoholism, and suicide. Make huge jumps in the 1920s and the 1930s. There's also a massive drop in birth rates as people, again, go divorce, cannot afford to get married, can't afford to have children, right? Um, Globally, one of the biggest problems that develops, and this is especially true in Western Europe, is what's known as hyperinflation. Germany is probably the best example of this. In Germany, after 1921, the existing government, known as the Weimar Republic, is unable to not only pay off its massive war reparations, but it's also unable to make payments on loans to many of the banks that it borrows money from, especially here in the United States. And so the Weimar Republic begins just simply printing more money in order to meet all of its obligations. This becomes a huge problem because as more money hits the market, especially paper money, without valuable currency to back it up, things like silver or gold or other precious metals, then that money begins to lose its worth. And many currencies in Western Europe become borderline worthless. The French franc, the British pound, the German Reichsmark, many of them become essentially worth less than the paper that they're printed on. And in these areas, people's entire life savings basically becomes completely empty money. It becomes absolutely worthless. At one point in 1923, the one US dollar was the equivalent of over 4 trillion German Reichsmark. That's how much German money was in circulation and how much money had been printed by the German government to try to cover their debts and their obligations. Now, as businesses and banks begin to fail, unemployment, especially in the West, hits upwards of 20 to 40%. This begins to filter down to the colonies in Africa and Asia as well, because demand for raw materials begins to plummet as people run out of money and have their homes foreclosed upon. They no longer have the income to be spending on disposable consumer goods. So production drops dramatically. As production drops, the demand for raw materials from those colonies drops, and this leads to massive inflation and prices dropping worldwide on the global market for those goods, which means the economies in these colonial areas in the early 1900s um, basically just completely crater. With no demand coming from the West for their raw materials, um, things begin to stockpile, the prices drop dramatically. Farmers and plantation owners and companies and businesses in those areas begin to lay off workers and shut down as well. This starts a process of massive government intervention in order to try to stabilize these economies. Again, when you get to APUSH, this will be a huge topic with FDR and the New Deal. But as the Depression worsens over the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, many people become very disenfranchised and disillusioned with not only democracy and democratic governments, but also with just globalized capitalism in general, right? And many of them begin to turn to new economic systems like socialism, like communism, and they begin to turn to new types of governments like fascism and totalitarian governments in order to find answers. So these are some images from post World War One Germany. What you see there are children playing with bundles of German money. Each of those bundles is 10 million Reichsmark. And essentially, this kind of illustrates exactly how worthless the paper currency of many of these governments had become, because so much of it was in circulation and there was very little economic production or precious metals to back up that currency. So essentially, it became worthless. Many of the most developed countries in the world go back to essentially barter economies where people trade goods and services directly with one another in order to just make ends meet. This is another photo from Germany in the 1920s, and as you can see here, this woman is literally lighting her furnace with money because, again, it was more valuable as a source of heat than it was to actually purchase goods or services.